night on the ancient chalklands of southern Britain near Stonehenge, and a dramatic excavation reaches its climax. Archaeologists, barely able to believe their eyes, have uncovered a 4,000-year-old skeleton, buried with more riches than they've ever seen in such a grave before.
Flint flake. Flint flake. Yeah.
It appears that this is a man from the very earliest Bronze Age. The builders of Stonehenge were his people. They saw the first metal working and the first gold. They created new crafts, new designs, and new rituals for life and death. They dragged Britain out of the Stone Age. But how they did so is a mystery, because the key players have never been found. Until now. This man was so important, he must have been one of them. A warrior, a trader, a magician, and more. The drama of a nighttime dig began during a routine excavation to clear the archaeology ahead of a new building project. This discovery is very special. Once opened, the burial with its priceless contents must be excavated immediately. Dr. Andrew Fitzpatrick of Wessex Archaeology already senses that it's the start of a very important story.
It is a particularly exciting find for the guys here. This is going to be one of the highlights of their archaeological career.
The 4,000-year-old grave dates from the mysterious Beaker period. The richest graves include 2 pots or beakers. This man has 5.
In front of his face, you can see he's got 2 pottery beakers laid. We've got the first one here, it's been laid on its side, so we've got the neck towards me, the base down the bottom here, and you can see the profile of the pot. And what's happened, it's been laid on its side, and the weight of the earth on top of it has compacted it.
1 copper knife might be expected. This grave contains 3 of them. Often, a small hunting kit is found. The man buried here was laid to rest with 2 full sets of archery equipment, including fine wrist guards, bone tools, and 15 exquisite flint arrowheads. In all, 100 artifacts lie waiting to be recovered, 10 times the amount ever found in such a grave. And now there's a suspicion that the burial might yield the ultimate treasure.
In some instances, we may find the evidence of, here's the gold.
Oh, yes.
Have a look.
Yes.
Torches on it.
This could well be the earliest metal ever found in the British Isles. It clearly defines a man of supreme status. His grave is a landmark discovery.
There could be a completely new story out there, one which the whole battery of scientific techniques that we can apply to archaeology will begin to tell us something of. And as those clues are put down, we have got to follow those clues, and I don't yet know where they're going to lead me, and I don't know where it will lead generations of future scholars.
The man is dubbed the Amesbury Archer, after a nearby town in the prehistoric landscape of Wessex. His grave is a snapshot of life at the time. The objects themselves, pottery, metal, flint and bone, would have come from many different places. They represent aspects of culture from an age when the British Isles were witnessing the greatest change in their human history. Wessex was becoming one of the richest and most powerful regions in prehistoric Europe. In the early Bronze Age, it was a different world. There was building work at Durrington Walls, a place for ceremony and feasting, surrounded by great embankments of earth. Its miniature neighbour, on a site which had already been used for centuries, was Woodhenge. A child's skeleton has suggested ritual sacrifice here, but no one can be sure from the evidence today. It's likely that both locations were linked to the River Avon. At this time, when even horse riding was a novelty, the river valley was the highway of the ancestors. And downstream, by the most dramatic curve in that highway, is the grave of the Amesbury archer. He lies almost within sight of Stonehenge, and in line with its processional way, the avenue. This was a ceremonial route from the river, marked out by shallow earth banks and ditches along which Stonehenge appears like a vision on the horizon. That vision was just being created in the archer's lifetime and aligned to follow the course of the sun. The work continued for hundreds of years. The stones have lost none of their power, especially on midsummer morning.
People would have valued it as a way of coming to thank the gods, to have, as we have all around us now, a great party, to meet people, to trade things, to exchange things. It's a central part of their annual cycle, part of the agricultural year, part of the natural world. The archer was born and lived at the time that when this monument was changed from being an earthen henge, maybe with a timber circle around it, to the great stone circles.
The richness of his grave proves that in this process the archer was no humble labourer, and Stonehenge was certainly no humble task.
You can't build Stonehenge by accident. It is a sophisticated piece of architecture. It needs quantity surveying, it needs planning, it needs the labour forces to be assembled, organised, fed. It's not a simple exercise, and there must have been people who were controlling it.
Perhaps the archer was a controlling figure. But then why wasn't he buried at Stonehenge?
We shouldn't see Stonehenge as a monument in isolation. It's part of a very complex, interlocking landscape in the 3rd millennium BC.
Dr. Mike Parker Pearson is a specialist in prehistoric ritual.
The main axis in that landscape is this, the river, because this is the route that people would have used in the funerary processions. The dead make their last journey down the river. All around these slopes, on both sides, we find some of the most remarkable burial monuments from that particular period and in the centuries after. Now, of course, what we've got to remember is that those are the very select few. We're looking at probably less than 5%, maybe less than 1% of everybody who lived in this district at that time. And it begs the question of where have they all gone? I think they're in there, thrown in either as cremated remains or as complete bodies.
So only the select few would receive a burial. And the richest amongst them? The Amesbury archer.
He was somewhere between the ages of 35 and 40. We know he was about 5'8" tall, so we've got a sort of picture of him coming through.
Jackie McKinley, an osteoarchaeologist, conducts the first examination.
That's quite a robust skull. You've got big supraorbital ridges there. It's a very rounded skull, very distinctive shape. You've got fairly strong muscle attachments, which suggests you've got maybe fairly strong neck muscles and that sort of thing. So he's quite a robust, striking-looking individual. Teeth don't look too bad, but we have got quite a bad abscess on one side here. So we've got a dental abscess there. Anybody who's ever had toothache knows how painful it is. And to have got to the stage where it's been so bad that it's actually burst through the bone into the surrounding soft tissue. I should imagine he was a bit like a bear with a sore head some of the time, and probably would have had rather bad breath, I suspect. We've got a patella missing, kneecap missing on that side.
As she begins to examine the leg bones, there's a horrific discovery.
Massive difference in the size of these two. One is far more robust than the other.
The man has been terribly injured, losing his left patella, the kneecap. As a result, the leg has become infected and withered.
You've lost the robusticity of the bone. They're the same length, so this is something that's happened once this person has reached adulthood.
Jackie McKinley decides to discuss the case with a colleague from modern medicine.
As you can see, comparing the two sides, you've got some sort of damage.
David Barrett is a leading knee specialist.
So these are big changes, aren't they? It's really quite striking, and we can see how the infection has eaten away the articular surface to change it from what should be a smooth area to a very rough area. You can see the end of the femur, which we've been talking about here, and the patella fits on the front. I guess if you're thinking of a traumatic way, you might have lost that, so that's going to be an accident or fall while hunting. Yeah. Or actually, if they had a battle, if it's taken off by a spear or some form of sharp thing. And of course, that would have left the chap with a huge open wound on the front of the knee. This would have hurt like hell. And then the wound would have become infected, and we know that would have been exquisitely painful. Infection in bone is one of the worst pains we have. And then, I guess, from what we've seen, the infection then took root in the bone, and then he would have just been discharging pus every day for the rest of his life. And that would have smelled bad. I realise they would have smelled bad anyway, but boy, this guy would have smelled worse. Yeah. And people would be able to pick him up downwind. I mean, people were dying of this injury as late as the Napoleonic Wars, and the treatment for this would have been to saw his leg off in Napoleon's time. So he's done remarkably well a few thousand years ago.
The healing that you can see, it's happened quite a long time before he died.
Yes.
This isn't something that just happened the week before he died.
Absolutely,
or a couple of months before he died.
Because it takes a while for these changes in the bone to appear, don't they?
Exactly.
So he's obviously survived a few years.
Yes, I would have thought so.
We know that his femur was externally rotated, so if I move my leg to match that of the femur, he would have stood like this. And we also know from what we've seen in the tibia that his knee was slightly bent as well. Now I know that without his kneecap, he won't have been able to straighten his leg. So as he would have walked forward, his foot would have caught the ground like this. So I think what people do when they have this problem is to lift the leg sideways like this. So he would have staggered along in this rather characteristic way. In terms of his day-to-day life, the effects of this injury would be enormous. This chap was extremely resilient. There's no doubt that he overcome the effects of this almost overwhelming injury. That required some force of character, I imagine.
Leg bones will undergo the first laboratory test. Can they confirm that the archer is from that crucial period between the Stone and Bronze Age? All it will take is a small hole in a bone, less than a spoonful of bone powder, and the accelerator mass spectrometer at Oxford University. The Amesbury archer may be unique, but we are about to discover he was not alone. There was a second grave next to his from which Wessex archaeology uncovered a second skeleton. And when those bones go for routine cleaning in their finds department, there's yet another extraordinary revelation.
Lo and behold, gold! And, this is the first time we have ever found gold in the finds room.
From mud clinging to the jawbone of that skeleton, Rachel Seeger-Smith teases out another set of gold jewellery.
It is sheer excitement to look at something that hasn't seen the light of day for, in this case, 4,500 years. It means that we have two important people. Maybe one had a more elaborate burial than the other, but certainly we've got a little cache of the clique, if you like, being buried out at Amesbury. The two pairs are very similar, but in size, shape, and certainly in the little repoussé dot decoration around them, the two pairs are almost identical.
If the two pairs are connected, could their owners also be connected in some way? Jackie McKinley decides to take a close look at the second skeleton.
We have got a male again. We've got these large suborbital ridges that we had previously. And that interesting shaped skull, that's very similar to what we've had before. It's quite short, rounded and flat at the back, which is like the one in the neighbouring grave. They're very similar. Those sutures aren't nearly as well fused. Probably got somebody about 20 to 25 years old. Right, he's got quite...
The biggest clues can lie in the smallest bones.
That's interesting.
The feet of the Amesbury archer had revealed an unusual detail.
Ah, now that's a bit odd. That shouldn't be there. The feet are really intriguing because the particular change in the calcaneum, which is the heel bone, and the navicular, which is one of the bones that sits to the front, those bones don't normally articulate within the foot. But in this case, we've got a little joint between them on both sides. And these can be family related. It's like inheriting blue eyes or brown hair or curly hair or whatever. And what was really interesting, and which, we're actually quite lucky to get, given the condition of the other skeleton from the neighbouring grave, is that also has this same morphological variation. Now, I've never seen this before. You've got these two chaps buried side by side with similar materials with them. They've got very similar looking skulls, and they've both got what is a relatively rare morphological variation. And it really does suggest that there is a family link between them.
But how close a link? Were they brothers? Father and son? Or separated by many generations? The answer may be revealed in the carbon-14 laboratory at Oxford University. Carbon-14 is a material that every living thing absorbs from the atmosphere. After death, it decays at a very precise, slow rate. By measuring how much has decayed, the laboratory tests will reveal how much time has passed. The preparation phase also has a useful byproduct. Measuring nitrogen and carbon isotopes along the way, the scientists can tell what the people have been eating. In this case, it's an inland diet of cereals and meat. Of course, the key question is when this was happening.
One lives for these type of projects. It's tremendously exciting when the dates come through, and for that brief moment, you and a handful of other colleagues are the only people in the world that know the true age of these items. It's tremendously exciting.
What is the true age? And are the skeletons separated by hundreds of years, or just a handful?
It's as though they're about in pretty good agreement. What we've done is to date both individuals twice. So there are two dates from the archer and there are two dates from his companion. The dates that we've obtained are mid-3rd millennium BC. To be precise, 2400 to 2200 BC. This is very interesting because it is in good agreement with what the archaeologists originally expected. In addition, we're also getting a great deal of agreement between the dates of both the archer and his companion, such that we think, on the basis of the radiocarbon dates, that they were contemporaries. Now, it may be that they were separated by a decade, maybe slightly more, but broadly speaking, at the moment, they look as though they're contemporaries.
The men are now firmly placed at the very beginning of the Metal Age in the British Isles. It's exactly what the archaeologists hoped for. And the dates take them further.
The archer is a little bit older, and as we know that there is a link between these two men, it allows us to think of them as perhaps being a father and a son. Now, I can't be sure about that because they could have been siblings or some other relationship, but a father-son one seems to be a very good relationship to infer on the basis of this evidence.
These men were family from the Beaker period. It was an age of enormous change, yet named very simply after the little clay beakers which people took to their graves. The archer's grave had 5, an unprecedented number.
That is ludicrously well preserved.
Well, it's just incredibly impressive. I mean, it's a fabulous collection for someone who's dealt with beakers all their adult life, like me. I mean, it is amazing, even though I've seen so many in the past. There were 2 beakers with plaited cord decoration out of well over 1,000 beakers in graves from the British Isles. There are literally a handful with plaited cord, and that's something that you get on the continent as well. There are 2 very beautiful beakers. They are very finely potted. The walls are only about 4 millimetres thick, which is about as thin as beakers get. And this one in particular has a funny little motif of little triangles hanging, and that's a very, very Scottish motif. In a sense, this beaker represents maybe contacts within the British Isles, whereas some of the others are more clearly linked to the continent in the style that they belong to.
John Hudson, a specialist in ancient pottery, is collecting clay just as our ancestors did. He's hoping to recreate the distinctive shapes and patterns which mark an entire period in prehistory.
These things are not cheap articles, they're something of high value because it takes so much time. And if you look at the originals, they were made very lovingly and very carefully and very skillfully. To make a pot like this will take several hours.
The beakers were decorated using combs or twisted cords pressed into the clay. Their designs were just a part of a whole new culture. It's as if there was a separate tribe arriving on the scene called Beaker people. Could this be the case?
Well, I don't think there were Beaker people. I think there were Beaker peoples. And there were people who made and used beakers, and I think that those people varied across Europe. Now, the idea of the beaker is clearly introduced, but it may be introduced by terribly successful salesmen, or it may be introduced by a wave of beaker settlers, and the answer probably lies somewhere between the two.
Somehow, the beaker culture spread from Africa on through mainland Europe and to the British Isles.
There is a package of artefacts that come over with the beakers, not just the beaker itself. And also it's tied up with the exploitation of local metal deposits, the onset of the Bronze Age, the experimentation with copper and copper ores. It seems to coincide, certainly in parts of Europe, with the domestication of the horse, and that may suggest that transport, movement, was much, much easier across larger distances.
Archaeologists have long believed that this new culture came to the British Isles with travellers from Europe, particularly the Rhineland. Yet the case could never be proved without finding a body. This is the first major opportunity, and Dr. Fitzpatrick has not one but 2 likely suspects.
We'll be looking to isotope studies to see if the 2 men were raised in the same place, and we'll be looking to see were they brought up in the same place as they eventually came to live.
At the British Geological Survey laboratories, geoscientist Carolyn Chenery will compare chemical residue from the men's teeth to rainfall patterns across Europe. She starts by melting the tooth enamel with a laser at 20,000 degrees Celsius, hot enough to melt rock. Although it sounds a highly unlikely process, the theory is clear. As our teeth form during childhood and teenage, they lock in oxygen isotopes absorbed largely from drinking water, which naturally starts as rain. Scientists have mapped how the isotope levels change across the continent of Europe. By comparing isotopes obtained from the teeth with the map, they hope to find out where the archer and his companion were from. Before they do, the results of another set of tests come in. At the British Museum, they're examining the metal from the graves. First, the two apparently matching sets of gold jewellery. Are they the work of the same person? And more to the point, what are they?
One of the leading ideas is that these ornaments actually were dress rings. They adorned the hair, or were some sort of headdress, some apparel on a headdress.
By bombarding the objects with X-rays, it will be possible to analyse the metal, which should naturally contain gold, some silver and possibly some copper. Comparing those results for each piece will reveal whether they are indeed pairs.
X-rays on.
All right. Oh, well, we seem to have some gold.
Yes, it is indeed gold.
They can't say where the gold came from, although it was certainly far from Stonehenge. Even the nearest sources are hundreds of kilometres away.
Copper and silver peaks are about the same.
But are these a genuine pair?
I mean, if you compare the spectrum here, it's exactly the same pattern.
Incredible, actually. So we can imagine them being designed as a pair from the outset and using the same little nugget of raw material.
I think that's fair enough, yes.
The younger man's jewellery is also a pair. But was it made at the same time and from the same gold nugget as the arches?
Concentrating in the central area here was the 3 gold peaks in the middle, and the interesting one here...
That looks different, doesn't it?
It's the copper. I don't think these two would have been made at exactly the same time from the same piece of gold.
Those objects weren't made at the same moment in time. There's a time lag here, and I think that fits in nicely with the idea that perhaps one of the individuals is a descendant of the other.
If gold is precious, the copper is priceless to the story. These are the earliest metal knives ever found in the British Isles, and we might discover where the archer got them, because copper can be traced to its source. A possible location? The west coast of Ireland. At Ross Island in County Kerry, archaeologists have located the earliest copper mine in northern Europe. It's unique and one of the most important discoveries about the Copper Age.
Well, this is one of the copper mines worked during the Beaker period at Ross Island around 2400 BC. And we can see here copper minerals which are exposed on the mine roof. And these minerals have these bright green and blue colours, which is probably how the miners found them those thousands of years ago. Metallurgy, the making of metal, was introduced into these islands around the time that Beaker pottery and Beaker culture was spreading, about 4,500 years ago. Now, it came from the continent where copper metallurgy had been established several thousand years previously. And some of the very first copper to be found in places like Wales and Scotland, and indeed going right into the Wessex area, actually comes from this very mine. The mine itself here was worked using a Stone Age technology. They lit fires against the rock face, and that shattered the surface of the limestone, and then this was pounded using stone hammers. And this broken rock was then taken out of the mine for processing in the mining camp. There is no doubt about it that Ross Island and all of the metallurgy going on at this time was a great technological achievement, because it involves a transformation of nature. It involves taking hard rock, a natural substance, and converting it into something completely different.
Early metal workers were magicians. They had no way of measuring temperature, they had no sense of metallurgy, they had no scientific thought. They were magicians. certainly contemporary craftsmen, have so much at their disposal for making contemporary objects that these men just simply wouldn't have had. If they were actually melting the copper, they would have used a very simple clay crucible, which would demanded a certain skill in itself to know what type of clay to use, for example, so the crucible would withstand the temperatures needed. During the melting of the copper, it absorbs oxygen from the air, and this leads to bad castings. So by actually covering the copper, say, with charcoal, they could actually create a reduction atmosphere to add to the quality of the castings that they produced. They'd have to actually carve the moulds, they'd have to make the moulds. They'd have to be aware of the necessity to preheat the moulds. Even to actually lift the crucible out of the fire, and that would have taken some skill. And I would guess that they would perhaps use green wood to do that. So many things that they did add up to so much technical and scientific knowledge that we take for granted. They were literally the first there. They had to invent the technology, they had to invent the scientific knowledge. They probably didn't even know they were doing it, but they did. You take a limestone rock and you end up with copper, a shiny copper object. Now, if that's not alchemy, transforming one material into another material, what is?
Did the Irish mines provide the Amesbury copper daggers? It looks highly likely until the British Museum analysed them. There's a big surprise.
A high nickel.
High nickel.
We
very
also
substantial arsenic.
Very substantial arsenic peak, as you can see there.
In two of the knives, the copper is identical. And it's not from Ireland. It's from Europe.
Well, the results are already quite astonishing, and I'm very surprised because two of the objects are of a metal that archaeologists have called bell beaker metal, that we think is coming up from somewhere in the Atlantic provinces further south in Europe, but it's in competition with Irish A metal, which is coming across the Irish Sea.
Interestingly, we don't have the nickel.
The third object is even more surprising because it turns out that it's made of an arsenic-rich metal which has virtually no other impurity.
That's just a complete background here, there's no actimony at all.
In fact, this part of
the third dagger is made from a very rare type of copper for its time.
There's quite a big concentration of that sort of metal in the western parts of France. Sources that have yet not been recognised by archaeologists were being exploited in the Copper Age.
So the archer and his people were trading way beyond Britain. And copper was coming from some places undiscovered by archaeology. There was an exchange network. But what was the currency?
Foodstuffs and cattle, probably over quite modest distances. And cattle, of course, live cattle, are very good at exchange medium because you can then keep them and consume them when you choose to. The other really vital ingredient in exchange networks is, of course, marriage partners. And there'd be no doubt that marriage partners would be being exchanged, sometimes perhaps, again, probably at the elite level, over quite considerable distances. So in this way they were beginning to forge alliances with other communities, and sometimes, of course, that would be very advantageous, particularly if those same communities they were forming a bridge with had privileged access to some of the rare materials they wanted.
In any society, a rich man is always a most eligible suitor. To recreate the archer in his finery, the archaeologist Julie Douglas began detailed research.
Due to the British climate and soil conditions, all the things that are made of wood and fabric and leather have rotted away. But we've got little clues, so like detectives we can build up from the clues, bringing in circumstantial evidence from all over Europe. At this period, in the rest of Europe and the Middle East, People had developed textile technology to the extent that we've got beautiful worked coloured linen textiles using perhaps 3 colours from the Swiss Neolithic, which is a bit earlier than this man here. We had a shale ring from the burial, and that looks, from other evidence that we've got from burials in Denmark, that it was used as a loop for a belt. And they didn't have a buckle. They used this. To weave that belt, you need 5 sticks and some loops of thread, and you've got a loom that can weave that. He would probably have had a pair of boots like these. So these shoes are made from one piece of hide. The original would have been raw hide, tied to your foot while it was wet, and then dried to shape. We know that the archer was buried with a large bone pin that was found by his shoulder. Nothing else has survived, but he must have had something that needed a big pin to hold it. So we've reconstructed from one bone pin a complete hide cloak. The original would probably have been deerskin. It's warm. This is actually a copy of a cloak that was thrown into a Danish bog. The cloak was of an ancient pattern used for perhaps ritual purposes. So he's got trousers. He's got a robe on top. We know he had some sort of cloak or shroud wrapped around him. He's important. If he's got 2 sets of clothes, even several thousand years later, I think he's pretty important to be buried with them.
All the archer's possessions symbolize the man and his time. Some look forward to the new era of metal. The majority look back. For 500,000 years, man simply relied on tools of bone, stone, and flint.
I'm sure he actually made a lot of it. Or at least if he didn't, a lot of it was the work of one man. This is the beauty of having a big assemblage.
The flint specialist on the team is Phil Harding.
An assemblage of 70-odd pieces of flint is incredibly important. You can actually compare the quality of workmanship and the way that the napper approached each arrowhead, the way he made them. And I know what it's like to make an arrowhead, and so I make these observations, and I'm sure that they're the work of one man. And this, if you like, is to me the crucial find. This is not a flint object, it's a piece of deer antler. But you see, I've also got one of these. This is what I use to make barbed and tanged arrowheads. Now, these things often occur in archer graves. And what's more, you see, he's only just coming out of the Stone Age. So, in other words, somebody who couldn't knap flint, even in the early Bronze Age, you know, I'm sure everybody would have done it. He was not an exceptional flint knapper. He was a good flint knapper, but he was not exceptional. So, no, I think he got where he got by some other means and not purely flint knapping.
As further evidence emerges, Harding's intuition will be justified. As they consider each find, his fellow archaeologists become more convinced that all is not as it seems. The rich huntsman's grave may convey a different message. The Amesbury archer was not revered for his skill with a bow at all.
The use of the archer imagery is an important identity that people were buried with. Whether it means he was a warrior or a very successful hunter, or both, we can't say.
The important thing is that the man had these things and that he could display them. Whether he could actually hit a barn door, if you had a Bronze Age barn door at 100 metres, was probably neither here nor there. It's the having them and displaying them that is important, not the using of them.
So what did earn him his great status? The answer lies in one small item, hardly ever found in a grave. 4,000 years ago, the man who owned this would have owned the power to turn rocks into precious objects. It's his cushion stone, a tool for working gold or copper.
The idea of the man being a metal worker is really based on the discovery of the cushion stone, this small black stone which had been used either as an anvil or as a tool for working very soft metals like copper and gold. These are very rare finds in Britain, indeed very rare in continental Europe as a whole. So the fact that there is one buried with this man would suggest that he, amongst other things, was a metal worker, and he would have been one of the first people in Britain to have been able to do that.
This rare and fine skill is contained in the gold from the grave. To recreate it, more than 4,000 years later, the craftsman Neil Burridge has at his disposal just fire, stone, wood, and molten gold. In such skilled hands, the gold transforms again and again in temperature, shape, and colour. How it happened was a secret known to just a few, and imported with the whole beaker tradition.
In the past, people loved to talk about beaker people, an invading warrior aristocracy who came across the channel and rode around and killed everybody. I don't think that an invasion hypothesis will wash. I think it's much more that the local people were agents in this change. I wouldn't rule out a certain amount of new people coming in, and certainly new specialists, such as metalworking specialists, specialist potters, etc.
The new pieces of gold jewellery are identical to the pieces found in the grave. They clearly show how the originals were fashioned by those magicians from abroad. Could the Amesbury archer, the so-called king of Stonehenge, have been just such an immigrant? British archaeology has never before found such a traveller. The existence of foreign people with new skills has never been scientifically proven. But now the isotope tests are complete. They will reveal where this man and his younger companion came from.
The younger man that we analysed, we looked at two of his teeth, and they're indicating that he's starting out his life in the Bristol Channel area and moving eastwards. The older chap is very interesting because he has, for both his older teeth and younger teeth, European signatures, which puts him somewhere in Central Europe and not in the British Isles. So he's very distinctly different. We're very positive that this man is of European origin.
More precisely, the man appears to hail from an area around modern-day Switzerland.
The discovery about the older man is really exciting. Not only is it one of the first times that we've been able to show this archaeologically, but it begins to unlock some of the mysteries as to why we have such a rich burial at this date. And if the man has come from a great distance, it may explain why he has so many rare and precious things.
It's like the jet set of the period. They really knew what would impress their families, their neighbours, their enemies. And so by having this whole range of novelties, from his golden hair ornaments or whatever, through to his new style archery gear, he was saying, I am really a very, very important, hip person.
He's the first European traveller from his time ever found in Britain. It appears he settled here, had a son, and was a leader when Stonehenge was being created. All on the strength of his mesmerising abilities with everything that was new. His grave was almost overwhelming in its riches. So for a considered view of how it all fitted together, the archaeologists undertake a unique experiment. They swap their customary trowels and mattocks for antler picks and cows' shoulder blades, the tools of the late Stone Age. 4,500 years on, they'll recreate the grave and the burial. In the excavation, there was faint evidence of some sort of coffin.
That's better.
The team think this was a wooden chamber made of split logs. The experiment suggests that this timber chamber would have lined the grave. It means that the bearers had to lay the body in separately, in full view of everyone at the funeral.
We really have to think of the act of burial in the Bronze Age as being rather like theatre. The dead don't bury themselves, and they don't choose the form their funeral will take. They don't choose what will be buried with them. They can't control that. All those are acts by the mourners, and you have to think in terms not just for somebody dying, but by that death, an office becoming vacant, a status becoming available, and the mourners making a show of their own status, using that funeral as an occasion.
What we're seeing buried is something old, something new, and these are part of the way that his identity is being created, not only in the past of what he was when he was alive, but also for the future in the next world.
Wealth, if it existed as a concept, would have been very different from modern-day conceptualization of wealth. There wasn't the capacity really to store wealth to quite the same degree at this early period of metallurgy. It may be that many objects were absolutely inextricably linked to the individual. They were almost a part of that person.
You're sending this person off into the other world, the world of the ancestors and the gods and the spirits, with a persona that says, I'm an extremely important person. It's certainly an example of very conspicuous consumption, because what people were doing was consigning this stuff to the grave so that the person who was going to the next life was extremely well equipped.
He represents something new. Before this time, there were individuals of importance and status. None of them compare to the authority and status that we see played out in the burial of this man. He brings rare and exotic things, and we see that the mourners bury him with a quantity of these goods that is unparalleled in Britain. He came from a great distance. He's come from somewhere near the Alps. It's an astonishing story. It's a Bronze Age biography.
Think you're immune to advertising hype? Don't be too sure. Frontline examines how mass media cuts through the clutter and influences your decisions. Next, on The Persuaders.